Hi, this is the third tape in the series, Theology 353, Women in the Old Testament. What we're going to be talking about on this tape are particularly women in the remainder of the Torah, the Pentateuch. Pentateuch, first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. We're going to be examining some things from Exodus and Numbers this week, and then probably do something on Leviticus in class, and then we'll be moving on to Judges after that. Okay, so we're looking for women and the role of women in the book of Exodus. And you don't have to look too hard, you don't have to look too far. They're right there, and they're really, really important women. But what I find particularly interesting about these passages is that unless you're actually looking for them, unless you're putting on a lens and saying, I'm going to see the role of women in these passages, unless you do that, you'll read right by them and you won't even notice. And I'm becoming increasingly convinced that that is a deliberate effort on the part of, first of all, the editors of these works, and second of all, the communities of reading. We're actually told how to read these by the way they're framed and the way that the stories are communicated. So one of the things I think we're going to see here is that the story of the women in Exodus, or the Exodus story, or the story of the Israelite wilderness wandering, the story of women has been suppressed and censored, but fortunately for us, not enough. So we really can actually uncover some of these stories. The first part of the tape today, I'm going to be reflecting a lot on the handout I gave you by Phyllis Tribble on Miriam. So this is, in essence, an expansion of that in some ways and an introduction to it in others. So I don't know whether you read it first and now you're watching the tape, or you're going to read it after you see the tape. But in any case, there'll be a lot of overlap. Okay, so where do we start with the book of Exodus? We actually start with the story of women resisting male patriarchal leadership. It's right there. You know the story. It's a story about an evil Pharaoh in Egypt who begins to oppress the Israelites. I want to begin with chapter 1, verse 15. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, the midwives are the first group of women that I want us to concentrate on, said to the midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah. There is, by the way, a Jewish tradition that these two women are, or one of the women, Shiphrah, is actually Moses' mother, and that as a reward for her faithfulness, she was given the honor of giving birth to the deliverer of Israel. But that's just a tradition. It's not actually in the text. But they are women. Shiphrah and the other Puah, and this is what the Pharaoh says, when you act as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, she shall live. But the midwives feared God. They did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but they let the boys live. So the first significant narrative event within the book of Exodus is an account of the resistance of two women to an express desire on the part of a male leader to destroy the Hebrew race. So the two women save the Hebrews in the story. The second significant account is also an account of a woman who resists the Pharaoh's authority. And that's chapter 2, and we have an unnamed woman. Moses' mother is named elsewhere as Jochebed. Chapter 2, verse 1, now a man from the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine baby, she hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him, plastered it with bitumen and pitch, put the child in it, placed it among the reeds on the bank of the river. So here we have, first we have the Hebrew midwives who refuse to follow the Pharaoh's orders and they preserve the lives of the male babies. Now we have this unnamed Levite woman who goes further, and when she gives birth to a son, she conceals that son from the authorities. But there comes a point, you know, children get older and they get noisier and they get more mobile, and there comes a point where she could no longer conceal the child. And at this point, we are introduced to the woman I think is most important, most prominent in the book of Exodus, and that is the named woman Miriam, who is, and you always have to in Hebrew Bible link the woman to some man, even when the woman outshines the man, and she is introduced alternately as Moses' sister or Aaron's sister. Aaron is the older brother of Moses. Miriam is the older sister of Moses, and this is how they're all linked in one nice, happy family. So after we get to the point where Moses' mother can no longer conceal him, that's when Miriam comes in. And we have the account beginning here, verse 4. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. Now, Miriam is not given explicit directions by her mother. She's following the basket, and she has to think on her feet. She has to figure out what to do in order to preserve the life of her baby brother. Verse 5 brings us to the other group of women in the story. And what we end up happening here is the first instance of a motif we're going to see frequently this semester, which I call the woman's conspiracy. An account of not an individual woman, nor a woman working with a man, but groups of women doing things together that expressly try to transgress the male leadership. So this is an example of a woman's conspiracy. So we have a conspiracy between the midwives, the Levitical woman, unnamed at this point, her daughter, who will later be named Miriam, and now we have another unnamed woman, the Pharaoh's daughter, and her attendants, who are clearly female characters. And now they come in, and every single one of these individuals is absolutely important to establish this conspiracy against the decreed law of the Pharaoh. So verse 5, the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river. While her attendants walked beside the river, she saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid to bring it. When she opened it, she saw the child. He was crying. She took pity on him. This must be one of the Hebrews' children, she said. And here comes Miriam again. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and get you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you? And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, yes. So, ironically, the conspiracy between Miriam and the Pharaoh's daughter results in Moses being returned to his mother and being nursed by his actual biological mother. Just want to make a vague suggestion here, because I cannot prove it, but there's enough of a sense of a conspiracy in this that one almost has to wonder if all of this had been arranged beforehand. It's so convenient. The basket just goes down, and it just happens to land in just this place, and the woman, the maid picks it up, and it must be one of the Hebrews' babies. And then this woman, this girl comes out of the bushes and says, I know a Hebrew midwife for it, and she says, okay, and sends the baby back along with his true sister to their mother. So one can perhaps suspect the possibility that this has all been prearranged. But in any case, prearranged or spontaneous, there are two key features I want you to understand from this. The first is, as I pointed out, what we have here are absolutely essential women, women who are crucial to the ongoing development of the narrative. The narrative, of course, will focus on the man, Moses. And part of the reason we don't notice these women is because that's where our focus is, because he is the savior of Israel, according to the official documents. But let's move on and see where Miriam enters into the career again. I'm going to skip over. For one thing, a very interesting account of Moses' wife, Zipporah. Let me just mention it in passing. I didn't really plan on covering this in class, and you want to attend to this because, first of all, his wife is named Zipporah. She has some spiritual stature and insight on her own. She was raised as a priest's daughter in Midian. And this is what happens. On their way back from the wilderness, where Moses is on his way to Egypt to fulfill his divine commission, all of a sudden the Lord tries to kill Moses for no apparent reason. And Zipporah immediately recognizes the danger of the situation and acts. And what she does seems kind of odd to us, but probably made some sense in terms of rituals and requirements that were familiar to her. Anyway, what she does is she immediately unwraps her newborn baby and circumcises him, and then takes the circumcised foreskin and touches Moses with it, and for some reason that turns aside the illness. Now, there are all kinds of theories about why that happened and what it means, and it's not relevant for us. What's relevant for us is we have a resourceful woman, Moses' wife, who knows just what to do in a very dangerous and volatile situation where Moses was dying. And then now we come here to this second account of Miriam. Moses, of course, is grown up, and he has successfully brought the Israelite slaves out of Egypt and through the Sea of Reeds, and now they're wandering in the Sinai wilderness. And they're really, really happy because they've just seen their enemies destroyed. And we're introduced in Exodus chapter 15 to a song. And the introduction to the song, beginning in verse 1, then Moses and the Israelites sang this song to Yahweh. And give you a little bit of the song. I will sing to Yahweh, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and rider he has thrown into the sea. And the song continues throughout most of chapter 15. But what is interesting for our purposes, and I'm just going to kind of hint at this because I really want you to read the Tribble article carefully, what's interesting for us is what occurs in verse 20 of the same chapter, chapter 15, verse 20. Listen to this. Then the prophet Miriam. Now, this is the first, not the last, but the first time that a woman has been mentioned as a prophet in the Hebrew Bible. No introduction. In fact, Moses is called a prophet, but not yet. He's called a prophet later in the narrative. So here we have, without any introduction, without any explanation of what it means, Miriam is introduced as a prophet. Then the prophet Miriam, Aaron's sister, took a tambourine in her hand, and all the women went out after her with tambourines and with dancing. And Miriam sang to them, "Sing to Yahweh, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and rider he has thrown into the sea." And I'm not going to trace Tribble's argument now on this tape, but she argues very persuasively, in my opinion, that the song which is placed in the mouth of Moses at the beginning of the chapter is in fact the complete text of the song that Miriam sang. And that what we have here in verse 20 is the true introduction to the song, and then we're given this very abbreviated version because the song is then placed in the mouth of Moses. Perhaps it shouldn't be called the Song of Moses as it is traditionally, but rather it should be called the Song of Miriam. And notice she's called a prophet, and she leads the women in this liturgical singing, which, as we'll see in later classes and later texts, is a very, very important and politically charged role that women have in the Hebrew Bible. So she sings the song, the same song that Moses sings, only she's given it in an abbreviated fashion. And pay careful attention to Tribble's argument about this passage and the way she thinks this passage might have originally been structured. Now, people can say all kinds of wild things about some imaginary original form of the text, and most of that stuff, I think, is real garbage. However, I think Tribble carefully lays out her argument and gives her reasons, and as I said, I think her reasons are persuasive. You decide for yourself whether they are persuasive to you, and I hope we'll talk about that. Actually two more important events in Miriam's life we want to examine. The first one, the second one is her death, so that's why I wasn't counting it. The first one I have some real mixed feelings about. First of all, Miriam is betraying here some real significant prejudices, which I don't find particularly attractive in her. So we want to examine that and face it squarely. But then I think there's evidence here, and I was first exposed to this idea from an address that Phyllis Tribble gave, and I think, as I remember it, I think the article is a written form of her address. And that's when I first thought about this, and it was one of those things that once somebody shows it to you, you can't help but see it everywhere, and you can't imagine how you never noticed it before. So I'm hoping that a similar thing happens to you, but again, you be the judge. Miriam institutes a wholesale rebellion against the political leadership of Moses. Now, of course, the book of Numbers, where we're going to be reading this from, Numbers chapter 12, by the way, is an advocate of Moses, and Miriam is not coming off very well in this passage. But at the very least, it shows an enormous amount of influence and power that she had in Israel. That's not quite reflected any longer in the text, except in these hints. So see if you're convinced as I take you through this. This is chapter 12, beginning with verse 1. If you have the new RSV, it's page 182. While they were in Hazarot, Miriam and Aaron, and here notice that Miriam is not paired with the women of Israel, but with her brother Aaron. Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman whom he had married, for he had indeed married a Cushite woman. The emphasis here is on Moses' in unpropitious marriage. He married a foreign woman. And what makes it even a little uglier is, although it's rather difficult to locate Cush in the modern-day Middle East, the tradition regarding Cush is that it's Ethiopia. And so what we have here is some kind of a prejudice against a darker-skinned people. In any case, nobody knows who this Cushite woman is. Some people even suggest that it is indeed Zipporah, who I spoke to you about earlier. But in any case, they're arguing against the validity of this marriage. But it seems to go much more serious than that, because then they start talking about Moses' authority, particularly Moses' authority relative to them. So what we're going to have to do is examine rather carefully the interpersonal dynamics between these three siblings. So on the first part, of course, we have Moses, who is the most prominent figure and ultimately will win this confrontation. And then we have his older sister, Miriam. And I think the older part of it is quite important. You know, I was writing an article about Aaron and Moses in a different context. And without even thinking, I inadvertently said that Aaron was the younger brother, because he acts like the younger brother. I knew he was the older brother, and probably that's where some of the resentment comes in, that these are older siblings who have clearly been overshadowed by their younger brother. And in the case of Miriam, her younger brother that she had saved his life. So in any case, they start attacking Moses' authority. They say, verse 2, and they said, has Yahweh spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us also? And Yahweh heard it. So the argument is an argument between the notion of Moses as this absolute authority versus Moses in a kind of shared leadership. And actually elsewhere in the Pentateuch we do have evidence that Moses wants to share the leadership. So they're saying, has Yahweh spoken through Moses alone, or has he not also spoken through us? And then we have that ominous rumbling that the narrator gives us. The Lord heard it. So here's what happens. Verse 4. Oh, actually, I should read a little bit more because the narrator editorializes. And Yahweh heard it. Now the man Moses was very humble, more so than anyone else on the face of the earth. Suddenly Yahweh said to Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, come out, you three, to the tent of meeting. Now that's scary. The tent of meeting. They're going into the principal's office. And I imagine at this point Miriam and Aaron are getting pretty nervous. So they're going into the tent of meeting to appear before Yahweh. Verse 5, Yahweh came down in a pillar of cloud, stood at the entrance of the tent, and called Aaron and Miriam, and they both came forward, and he said. And what follows is a complete, unreserved endorsement of the leadership of Moses. So Miriam says, has Yahweh spoken through Moses alone, or has he not also spoken through us? And what Yahweh says is, sure, Yahweh's spoken through you, but nothing like the relationship that I have with Moses. Verse 8, with him, Moses, I speak face to face, clearly, not in riddles, and he beholds, and there's few places in the Bible where they will ever say anything like this, and he beholds the form of Yahweh. The form of Yahweh. He sees Yahweh as he is. So the idea is he just sits across a table with Yahweh and they talk. And that's not the way Yahweh speaks to Miriam and Aaron. But that's not the important part either. This is all an argument for the superiority of Moses' leadership. But look at what happens. A cloud, verse 10, when the cloud went away, because what happened? They went into the tent of meeting, and Yahweh came down in this pillar of cloud. And then the cloud lifts after this ringing endorsement of Moses. And when the cloud lifts, when the cloud went away from over the tent, Miriam had become leprous, white as snow. Now, we don't exactly know what disease this is, which the NRSV translates as leprous. It's probably not Hansen's disease, which is the modern medical term for what is more popularly called leprosy. But it's some kind of a hideous, disfiguring skin disease that turns the skin kind of white and flaky. From the text here and from some other references, very hideous to look at, first of all, and second of all, regarded to be very contagious. So the person who is so stricken is not only suffering a hideous, disfiguring disease, but she or he is also ostracized from the community, cast out from the community. So the cloud lifts, and Miriam has leprosy. Nothing has happened to Aaron. Now, at the beginning of the story, it says, Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses. But when Yahweh punishes the rebellious ones, it's only Miriam that's punished. Why? Well, I want to bring forth two theories, and I really prefer the other one, and it's only since listening to Tribble. One theory would have that, of course, Miriam is the one punished. She's the woman. And for a woman to try to usurp authority over a man is a worse transgression than for one man to try to usurp authority over another man. So one way of reading this story is to suggest this as a typical example of the absolute and complete unacceptability of women usurping any kind of power. So that's one theory. The other theory, which, as I said, I heard from Tribble and I find increasingly intriguing, is that Miriam is the one punished because Miriam is the ringleader. Now look at it. First of all, Miriam is the spokesperson. We have here that Miriam and Aaron spoke against, well, no, it says they said, has Yahweh spoken only through Moses? No, I remembered it as Miriam talking, but in fact it's unspecified. But we have indications, as I'll show you in a few moments, and again, follow the argument more closely from Tribble, that Miriam is in fact the person who institutes this rebellion. First of all, the reaction of Moses and Aaron, or perhaps I should say the reaction of Aaron and Moses, is terror. I mean, all of the kind of sibling rivalry that's taking place between these two brothers and one sister, it drops immediately, and they band together and they beg Yahweh to heal her, to restore her to them. Because at this point she's outside the camp and she's miserable. Look at the description, verse 11. Then Aaron said to Moses, "O my Lord, do not punish us." He's first addressing Moses as my Lord. So a complete capitulation to Moses' authority. They call him Lord. "O my Lord, do not punish us for a sin which we have so foolishly committed." And look at the description of Miriam. "Do not let her be like one stillborn, whose flesh is half consumed when it comes out of its mother's womb." What a horrible, horrible image that is. And Moses cried to Yahweh, "O God, please heal her." But Yahweh said to Moses, "If her father had but spit in her face, would she not bear her shame 7 days? Let her be shut out of the camp for 7 days, and after that she may be brought in again." So Miriam was shut out of the camp for 7 days. Now notice two things. First, notice that there's no mention of her being healed. There's a certain stage in this disease, and this is described elsewhere in the Pentateuch. There's a certain stage in the disease where it still looks kind of gross, but it's no longer contagious. And the priest is expected to examine them, make that determination, and allow them to go back into the community. That appears to be what's happening here. Miriam is not healed in answer to Moses' prayer. Instead, Miriam is punished and restored once again to the community, but she's still covered with these white scales. And I never noticed that until I read Tribble's treatment of it. But look at this, verse 15. "So Miriam was shut out of the camp for 7 days, and the people did not set out on the march until Miriam had been brought in again." Now, we could read that in a very passive way, and we could think of it as, well, they just didn't leave yet. And it was incidental that they didn't leave yet until Miriam was once again allowed inside the camp. That's one way to read it. It seems more likely, however, that what we have here is a refusal to leave. They are not going to follow the divine pointers and guidelines until she, their leader, is restored once again to them. So what Tribble uncovers here, and again, rather persuasively, is a tradition of Miriam as a significant leader within the community of Israel. Now, obviously, in a power struggle against her younger brother, she loses. And the narrator strongly believes that Yahweh is supportive of Moses' absolute leadership. And the capitulation of Aaron, who just has a tradition of not being able to stand up against his brother, which is another reason why I think Miriam is the ringleader. Just completely collapses when Miriam's gone, calls Moses my Lord, and begs him to do something. But what we have here is a tradition of a woman claiming leadership, and obviously we see two significant examples where the people followed her. One is when she led the women out into the singing in Exodus chapter 15, and the other is here, where she begins a wholesale organized rebellion against the leadership of her brother, which ultimately fails. She completely drops out of the picture. She is not mentioned again except at her death, and I think there's something interesting to be noted there as well. That's Numbers chapter 20, and it's a very short reference. Chapter 20, verse 1, this is page 193. The Israelites, the whole congregation, came into the wilderness of Zin in the first month, and the people stayed in Kadesh. Miriam died there and was buried there. Now, there's nothing remarkable about that account except for what follows afterwards. What is it that follows immediately upon the death of this Israelite matriarch? Next verse, verse 2. Now there was no water for the congregation. So they gathered together against Moses and Aaron and said, and so on. The water shuts down following the death of Miriam. Now, these can be completely unrelated accounts. The death of Miriam and then the fact that the water dries up. But editors tend to place these things carefully. And unless there's strong indication otherwise, they usually will be commenting on each other. And what Tribble suggests, which I find very intriguing, is Miriam as a source of life. Miriam as a source of life-giving water to her community, both symbolically and literally, so that when she dies, the water dries up. It's a very interesting and intriguing observation. Okay.